Hi, Daniel. Thank you so much for doing this interview. The background for this interview is that we, the Fibromyalgia Association, we got a grant from Helsefonden to help us communicate scientific research about fibromyalgia to people with fibromyalgia and other with an interest, but with a non-research background, which is why I invited you here today. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes. First of all, thank you for the invitation. It's a big pleasure to be here. My name is Daniel Ciampi. I'm a doctor, neurologist. I had my training in Brazil and then in France. I did a lot of clinical research and also had clinical experience with patients. I had the chance to run and coordinate a very large pain center in Brazil for more than 12, 13 years and do some research in chronic pain in general with some focus on fibromyalgia. And since end of 21, I moved to Denmark for a position as associate prof here at Aalborg Universitet. And I'm now teaching and doing research, focusing on non-invasive treatments and non-invasive modalities of therapeutics for chronic pain patients, also with a focus on fibromyalgia.
Thank you. What I would like to talk about today is firstly a bit about epigenetics, but also about the work that you're doing now in Aalborg. Maybe you can explain epigenetics. I know it's pretty complicated and it's a big ask to explain it in a simple way, but
it's fine. So first, the name epigenetics, the word epi means something above. So the idea is that we're talking something that is beyond or above or oa. It could be Podensky oa genetic, because it's the same idea that happens above what genetics is doing. But we learned based on genetics, how the DNA is organized, that we have kind of a book, or all of our cells have a recipe, a Opschrift, where our cells can open and build proteins. And most of the things in our body are proteins, or enzymes, or muscles and proteins. If I'm a cell from the skin, I would open the book, How to Make a Skin, open, and produce everything I need to be a skin, to be part of the skin. And then I have my tissue, my skin. This is a book that is inherited by my parents. So I have always two books where I can have two options, or learn two ways to have a skin. Sometimes I can have just one of them, or sometimes I can mix the way the skin of my father is with my mother, and then I have my own skin. And then I open the book, I read, and I make my proteins, and I have my tissue, my skin. More or less 50 years ago, we discovered that there is another process that governs what happens to our bodies and how we produce the skin, for example. The book with the recipe, How to Make a Skin, it's very interesting because it's a book that has some pages that we cannot see. So our DNA, it has parts of it that we can just use. Our body can do whatever, produce the protein that it's saying we should produce. But there's a lot of pages that are locked. Imagine that there's a clip, a paper clip, that doesn't allow me to read. When I turn the page, there's 10 pages that move. And I can read whatever is written there, but not the locked pages. Sometimes locked pages don't have any recipe. It's just locked pages. They're not doing anything. They're just there. We have a huge part of our DNA that is not coding protein. They're just some locked pages because they're part of the structure of the book. But we found that there are some locked pages that can be unlocked and can allow us to read and have some extra proteins or new things that we did not have access before. And this is something normal that our body does all the time. But what is interesting is that these locked pages, they can be unlocked, or also sometimes I may have some pages that get locked, but by some type of effect, some mechanism that happens to me. So epigenetics talks about a series of mechanisms, a series of ways that can make our book or genetic material be read in a different way than the classic way. It can be by closing some parts of the recipe, or more often opening some extra pages of recipe for some new superpowers or sometimes bad stuff that our cells will be able to do that they were not supposed to be. If you just look at what's written, it's not there. But if you open, you have some extra pages, some unlocked pages. That's more or less how it works. And then we talk about how these unlocked pages were unlocked. So the mechanisms of epigenetics, we use some fancy words. We say methylation of DNA, micro RNA. These are mechanisms that allow you to remove the clip and have some extra pages. That's the overview. What's very interesting, there are 2 points that I think it's super interesting. One, these unlocked pages, once they are unlocked, they can be transmitted to my offspring, to my kids, which is something we didn't know before. So if I have this factor, this mechanism, for some reason, unlocking and opening an extra part of my gene potential that now will be read and will become an enzyme, this can be transmitted to my kids. That's extremely interesting, because when Darwin was very famous in writing his books about natural selection, there was a French researcher called Lamarck who had a very different view. He thought that the giraffe, for example, a giraffe had a long neck because she would try to stretch the neck, and that attempt to stretch the neck would be transmitted to his offsprings, to his kids, giraffe. And that was seen as crazy and wrong when Darwin proved to be right. In a way, this view comes back to Lamarck's idea that something that happens to me and unlocks my potential with these epigenetic factors can be transmitted to my offspring. That's one thing. Another very important thing is that this factor that can unlock part of my pages of my book, How to Make a Skin, they can be effective to unlock these pages only in some phases of my life.
Okay.
So some epigenetic mechanisms only happen in a specific moment of my life, not all the time. I'll just give you a practical example, which will help explain. You have a mice, a rat. It's normal when rats have babies that in the first days of life, mothers will lick and groom the babies. That's a normal behavior. And researchers knew that if you don't let the mothers lick the babies, they die faster or earlier than expected. And then researchers discovered that for some reason, when the mothers lick the babies and groom them, the newborns, rats, the newborns that are licked, they start to produce hormones that help the immune system. What is super interesting is that researchers discovered about 15 years ago that this is an epigenetic process. Only within a few weeks after rats are born, they are sensitive to the licking, to the grooming, and the licking and grooming can unlock part of their DNA to be read and produce these good hormones that protect them against infection. Grooming them later does not unlock the pages.
So there's a window for the...
There is a window. Now, what I'm talking about is that in the case of these rats, being licked and being groomed was an external stimulus that led to epigenetic mechanisms to occur and unlock these potentials. But there are some things in the bad sense. For example, there's some research showing that some people are born with a predisposition to have psychosis, to have psychiatric problems if they have contact with marijuana in a specific moment of their lives, early teenagers, for example. Well, it's not everyone, it's a small proportion of people, but they are born with this tendency. And this tendency is also controlled by epigenetics. If they have contact later in life, they will not have side effects, this big side effect. They may have other side effects, but not these ones. So these are just two examples of how epigenetics mechanisms can unlock hidden pages of our books. Part of the DNA not be available for our cells to use if it was not that time, that mechanism. And also that this can be, doesn't mean that it's 100% of times, but these processes can be transmitted from one generation to the other. These are the overview talk about it, yeah.
I have some more questions. So you're saying that you unlock or open some pages, but you don't change the other pages, correct?
Yeah, but the unlocked pages may influence the other pages.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it can be super complex because these things don't happen just in one gene. It can happen in a block, a package of genes at the same time. So it becomes like a process that goes in one direction or the other direction. It can be very challenging.
Okay. I want to ask a bit about the inheritance part. When we talk about chronic pain, can you be predisposed for chronic pain?
That's a very nice point. We don't know. Yes, we can. So there's a lot of research saying, for example, that some chronic pain types are more prevalent if you have parents or family members with that. For fibromyalgia is more common if you are in a family where your mother has fibromyalgia. That's known. Headaches, primary headaches, migraine, it's super known. It's very common that you have migraines and your father or your mother, sometimes both, or your brother, and maybe your son will have headaches. This is also very common. But it doesn't mean that it's genetically predisposed. You may have more because you have some behavior, just like your mother has X behavior, and you may have predisposed not by genetic mechanisms, but just because you are in an environment that has this. This is one thing. The second thing is that it doesn't mean that it's epigenetic mediated, even if it's genetic. All these examples, they are not like having a hereditary disease. We are very used when we go to school, collegium, we talk about diseases where you have one gene that is altered, and then you have a disease. These situations are relatively rare. We have a lot of diseases that these are mono gene diseases, but these are relatively rare. It's much more common to have a group of genes that you may have them slightly altered, but in combination, the end process is you being more predisposed. But you cannot really point to one. It's a package. And it's even hard to measure this because it could be some genes playing a role making this predisposition in one person, but other genes being the drivers in another. So we say that it's a polygenetic trait that we cannot measure. There's something to do with genes, but it's like a lot of genes interacting one with the other, but the end result is that you have the predisposition.
I think that's a very important point to make sure to say that just because you have fibromyalgia doesn't mean that your kids also gets fibromyalgia.
It doesn't mean.
Last question about this. You're saying that something happens, there's an event at a specific time in your life. Could you give an example to what could that be?
It can be many things. It could be sun exposure. related to some diseases or some situations. It could be drugs. There are some drugs that unlock some of these processes. Cancer uses epigenetic mechanisms to grow. Our body uses epigenetic mechanisms to protect us from cancer. So it's not a good or bad thing. It's just one way that our body uses to create new proteins, to read the genetic material. So it can be a physical agent, a chemical process. It can be an emotional experience. There are several reports of very different things.